Morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Today, I'm joined by Joe Patton again. Joe was wearing his winter milk hat a couple of weeks ago with Aidan in Johnstown Castle, and today he's wearing his Nutritional Specialist role hat in relation to body condition and how we're going to deal with that. So the lads are in Moorepark there. John McCabe and John Paul Murphy, our farm manager in the Moorepark farm, are just getting set up there at the moment. They have a couple of cows in the crush that they're going to show us in terms of the body condition score, and just to outline how often John Paul does it and the decisions that he makes around it. And then Joe is going to talk about how to deal with cows that may be a little bit in the low side in terms of condition, coming into very close to dry off now at this stage. And obviously maybe time getting a bit tight for some of these ladies to be in proper order for calving. So John is doing a lot of discussion groups out in around the territory down around Moorepark, and he's of the opinion that there's a lot of first calvers still milking, and they're going to be under pressure if they're going to calve in February in terms of body condition. So we will pick up a little bit with those. Joe, do you want to make any comment there just while we're getting set there with John in relation to, we'll say maybe cows even, you have two extremes, I suppose. You have the thin cow and you have cows that are maybe after getting fat over the course of the late lactation, maybe not milking a lot, but milking on and putting that condition on their backs as well. So how we deal with those.
Yeah. Morning, Stuart. Yeah, look, I suppose as the lads are they're nearly ready to go there, but I suppose, there's plenty of charts and plenty of stuff about, what the optimal condition is, and we hear 2.7, 3.25 or 3.5, whatever the figure might be. But I think maybe the lads, as they go through it now, I think the main thing really is to just get a practical feel for what the right condition looks like, and maybe most importantly then, and maybe John Paul will come to that, is you have to make a decision on it. There's no point in going out and scoring the herd and saying, that's the condition score. It's the decision you make after, I suppose, that's the main thing. So I suppose at this stage we probably want to be looking and finding out the ones that are a bit behind target. They're going to be at risk of poor production and maybe poor fertility next year. So really, when you talk about the effect of nutrition on fertility, a big part of that is body condition score at drying off, or a body condition score at calving down, really. So that's the first thing. So too thin, you could run into problems with fertility next year, and obviously over conditioned and too heavy or too fat at calving down, the risk is then really problems with metabolic diseases like milk fever. So it's trying to get that fit but not fat thing in the middle. So maybe let the lads have a look there and see what they have in Moorepark and see what the cows are like there. So John, maybe, we're ready to go.
Yeah. How are you, lads? So I'm just joined here with John Paul Murphy, who's farm manager here in Moorepark. And so we're just going to go through the technique of the body condition scoring and a few bits around the body condition scoring schedule here in the year and what decisions to make around it. So
John Paul here in Moorepark, just going to go through the condition scoring of some of the cows. I suppose it's a basic technique of checking the fat reserves on the cow. So we're going from a very thin to a very fat score. We're going from 1 to 5, increments of 2.5. So I really want to see what the fat reserve is on the cow at any given time. So there's 3 main points you want to work off of. You want to work off of the pins at the back, the line up here, and the ribs. So as you can see, in the back of this cow, the pins are very prominent. Again, the line is very sharp. You can see the 5 indentations here, and the ribs the same. So this cow, to me, I would score at 2.5. So quite low at the moment. She has been dried off, so it's 2.5 to give her. The next cow here is slightly different. As you can see visually, the cover is a bit stronger. The pin bones, small bit more flesh in them. Over the line again is a bit more flesh, and down along the rib a bit more. So I suppose the key when you're actually physically body scoring cows is to make sure that your hand is actually flat and firm at all times. So when you're at the back, you can put the fingers in here, which is okay. And over the line then, press in nice and firm so you can feel the sharpness of the ribs or the line. So we move on to this cow again. The next cow here is actually in good body condition score. She's a condition score of 3. Visually, you can see she's a heavier frame in her. And at the back of her here in the pins, there's a stronger cover of fat in her.
I might just go around there.
Yeah, perfect. So as you can see, she's a lot more fat over here. And just up along the line again, you put the hand flat here, not near as sharp as any of the other cows. A bit more cover again, and down along the ribs. This lady again, we score her at 325. She's a lot more cover here. Over the line again, you can only barely feel the ribs. At 9 and down along the ribs again, you've good cover here. This cow here is smaller than fat, as you can see at the back. She is over fat, well over fat. She's a condition score of probably 375, too heavy, to be honest. So up along the line again, huge cover here, and down along the ribs, massive cover again. I suppose one big thing, I suppose, when you're actually doing this in the crush, you don't want the animals bailed up too much. You want to give them space and freedom to stand so they're not pressed up against each other.
So that their arch won't be up in the, their back won't be arched up in the air, and they won't be flexing their muscles or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah. So there we go. There's 5 or 6 cows in a row in order of condition, and that's the main way you do it. John Paul, another thing on body condition scoring. Do you look at the V there on the hips?
Yeah, exactly. We do. We want to make sure that I suppose from a visual point of view that the V is not too strong.
Just maybe here, if there's a very prominent V, maybe you might see a cow there in March or April that's after losing a lot of condition.
From a visual point of view.
Prominent V here, but to see here, there's absolutely no difference.
There's a full fat cover over this cow, so
we might just go down and look at the thinnest one here, and just to show that bit.
John, just while you're going down there, there's a question in, does John Paul think that there's any difference in condition scoring the Frisian cows versus crossbred cows? I think we might be after losing you, John. You might be after moving too far away from the signal.
Right.
Yeah. So, Joe, do you want to pick up on that, maybe?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a good question from Connor. Maybe I don't think the condition probably not that different in terms of keep the scale and the technique the same, maybe. But maybe it is something that some farms are saying, particularly now, is to see maybe more as a lot of more. There's obviously a lot more mature crossbred cows around. Maybe they're at slightly higher risk of overconditioning. Stuart.
Yeah, okay. I think the boys are back there.
Yeah, their intake. You know,
can you hear us again?
Yeah, it's their intake that goes over the dry period. Sorry, Stuart. Yeah.
All right.
Sorry about that, lads. We lost
last connection. Yeah, Grant.
So could you relay the question again there to me, Stuart, please?
Yeah, it was just Conor Creedon was asking, is there a difference in condition scoring the black and whites versus the crossbreds? Okay,
so we have a question in there from Conor Creedon. So is there a difference between body condition scoring the black and whites versus body condition scoring the crossbreds?
There's not really, no. It's again, it's down to the physical feel. There's no difference in the body condition score now.
Okay, so it's all about putting the hand on the cow.
Exactly, and the firmness of the hand. You have to actually put them in the crush to know exactly what the fat reserve is on your cow.
Okay. And John Paul, just a question there for myself. So, what's the schedule for body condition scoring here during the year, and have you done it this autumn yet?
Yeah, I suppose as a research farm, we're doing it very regularly here. We do it twice a month, but I suppose from a farm perspective, we'd like to do it probably 2 to 3 times in the year. So I would have all my cows done well in advance of October, so I know what my cows are coming into the end of the year and pre-drying off. So I suppose what I'm trying to do there is I'm trying to select any cow that's in low condition score, and maybe some of my first lactation heifers, pick them out early for drying off and to work on them especially. And then again, pre-breeding, maybe 5 to 6 weeks pre-breeding is another good time to do it, because you've everything in control ahead of the breeding season. So we would always make sure it's done at that stage as well.
Very good. And I suppose, John Paul, the key point there is that you're acting early, you're getting it done in October, and you're giving them the longer dry period.
Exactly. You're giving yourself a chance to react, and you can make changes. If you leave it too late, you can't make changes. So I would say the sooner you can do it, mid-October, in this time of the season, just so you're well in advance of the drying off period.
Just a question.
Over to you, Stuart, if you have any questions.
Yeah.
Just the targets, I suppose, that John Paul is operating to, John, is the one question that's come in there.
Okay, just the targets that you're operating at, John Paul.
Yeah, so presently, I suppose I have the condition score to cows at the moment is about 2.85. I'm looking to be calving down somewhere between 3 and 3 1/4. So we have to come up to that at the moment. So we have to bring it up probably another about 0.3 to bring it up more, you know. So again, pre-breeding again, we want the cows around the tree again at breeding time.
Okay, and are you managing body condition scores throughout the dry period then? Are you pulling out like a few very, very over-conditioned
Exactly.
ones?
So look, I'll batch my cows. I said we have condition scored here again this week. We've done it last week, and we'll batch the cows accordingly. So any cow that might be below 275 will get certain treatment. Your silage could well be good enough quality for that, but maybe if cows are lower than that, they need some additional feed to get into the point before calving.
Okay, and do you know what DMD the silage is that's going into the dry cows over the dry period, or is it varying?
It's not too bad. It's very consistent. It's 78% DMD at the moment. Yeah, 2 bits. So we're quite happy.
Okay, all right. So that's fairly high. So you don't just want to watch that you wouldn't be over conditioning cows. So
exactly, and that's another thing as well. Is you talk about batching cows while they go. The cows in high condition will be restricted on feed, and they're batched as well.
Well, I think it can be done very simply by just pulling out the few worst offenders, I think, rather than just going through the whole herd. Yeah.
That's it. Like, and it's usually small numbers, and if you one bit of space just to batch them out, it can make it very easy.
And John, just one comment in from John Paul, because he's been fair manager for a good number of years now, but we'll say as the time has gone on and EBI has progressed within the herd, now we would have always had a good genetic merit in the herd in Moorepark anyway, but has he noticed cows better to retain condition, we'll say, as EBI has improved?
Okay, so just a comment from yourself, John Paul, about you've been here for a good few years, and you've seen higher EBI cows coming in as the breeding program progresses. Yeah. Have you seen any difference in how body condition of the higher EBI cows lasts throughout the season, in the spring and in the autumn? Or
again, I suppose body condition score is as good as anyone, but at the same time, it's about the dry matter intake. For me is one of the big things. Make sure your cows have enough intake all the time, and once you're meeting that, there's no issues whatsoever, you know.
Okay, yeah. So I suppose a comment from myself there, Stuart. I kind of would see some high EBI herds seem to hold condition in the spring. But again, a lot of it comes down to the manager. That the manager is looking at dry matter intake and managing the body condition score throughout the season.
Very good.
Any more questions?
No, that's it. No, I think we're okay. We'll switch over to Joe. So thanks a million, John Paul, and thanks, John, as well. And thanks to the ladies who volunteered there for condition scoring.
Yeah.
All right, Joe.
Very good, Stuart. Yeah. Look, just a couple of things on that, I suppose. Yeah, definitely on the crossbred thing. Yeah, look, it's just a case that maybe the intakes on crossbreds per kilo of body weight is an advantage, obviously, when they're on grass. But just watch they don't get over conditioned, because they can eat. They can still eat. They can still eat very well relative to their body weight as dry cows. So there's some farms maybe saying that you just have to be careful on maybe if they're marsh calvers or whatever, to make sure they don't get over conditioned, I suppose. Yeah.
Where's the tipping point, Joe, then? In terms of, we'll say, obviously trying to get the balance right for the dry period, but not letting them get over conditioned. Like, what's in? Yeah, look at. Like I would always say you need 8 weeks, really, no matter what way you look at it, because they're only going to be dry for 6 weeks, really. Like.
Yeah, you're looking at 8 weeks, I suppose, anyway. And as John Paul was saying there, maybe the first cow we looked at the back of the crush that was at 2.5. You're saying, look, if that's a February calver now, or certainly if it's a February calver, maybe early March, you're probably thinking, maybe a couple of extra weeks break for that animal, just to give her a chance to put a little bit of an additional condition on. Now, John Paul's at high mid-70s. It's high DMD silage for dry cows. We would probably say maybe 70 as a standard dry cow silage would probably be enough for most cows, getting sort of 8 to 10 weeks dry, maybe 12 weeks for the heifers. 70 DMD silage will probably allow you to gain sort of somewhere around the 1/4 of a score to maybe 0.4 of a score, depending on depending on the length of the dry period. So if silage quality is very high, like over 75, and maybe if cows that are already at a condition score of 3, and maybe the later calvers in that situation would want their intake limited over the early part of the dry period. I would just say that if you're worried about cows that are over conditioned, Stuart, it's probably, and they're maybe in the March side of things calving down, and maybe if you're fully dry for Christmas or whatever, it's the sort of December, January time is the time to sort of hold them back. When you get closer to calving down, really what you want to be doing is allow the cow to eat the appetite in the last couple of weeks anyway, because they're naturally going to drop off in intake and naturally going to go into sort of a negative energy balance. So really, once you get to sort of 3 weeks from calving, it's too late really to be doing anything about condition. Do you know what I mean? So just be careful on that.
Physically can't intake anyway in that last 3 to 4 weeks.
Exactly.
So they're kind of naturally restricting themselves anyway, and you don't want to be
exactly. So exactly. So it's the sort of the mid, the sort of deep mid, sort of the midpoint before the midpoint in the dry period, really up to that first, the first month or 6 weeks dry is when you want to be, if you need to, making savings on or making restrictions. Now, the first cow at the top of the crush that John Paul showed, like, you probably wouldn't want her calving down any more than what she's at the moment. Yeah. And, in that case, you're probably saying you really want that cow sort of calving down probably the same as she went dry, not gaining a whole lot at all. Now, I would take your point on the EBI thing. There's a sort of a definitely looking at some of Stephen's work and some of the stuff we did years ago ourselves, looking at that, higher EBI cows do have the capacity to hold on to body condition a bit better, or maybe turn the corner in the spring a little bit better. But obviously John Paul is right on the no point in having the genetics for body condition if you don't feed them, certainly. But it is an advantage to do allow you to sort of manage body condition that bit easier. So there is something in that, I think, in terms of the breed type. But one of the most important things maybe around that, and one of the benefits of a higher fertility subindex, I think, from a body condition management point of view, is that if you can get cows calving once every 365 or once every 370 days, it kind of naturally fits into kind of 290 to 300 days milking, and then your 60 to 70 days dry, right? I see it a lot I've seen a lot of herds over the years, maybe where genetics for fertility was poor, and you had cows that were having long calving intervals and extended dry periods. Those were the ones that were most risky of problems with body condition, because they calved down, lost a heap of weight, then they put on far too much condition as stale cows or carryover cows, and they come back in then, and the cycle repeats itself in terms of problems. So I think if you can get the cows calving once every 365 to 370 days in a roundabout way, that's one of the most important things in terms of being able to manage body condition, funny enough,
kind of managing everything in the block, Joe, like.
Yeah, exactly. And that goes for winter and spring herds like, Stuart. I know we had Aidan on a couple of weeks ago from Johnstown, and he's calving once every 370 days, spring and autumn alike, and he has very little issues in terms of metabolic problems or over conditioned cows, because the cows are they're doing their 300 days, and then they have their 60 days dry or 65 days dry, and that's it. There's no kind of 100 days dry and all the problems that come with that, in terms of issues with extended lactations and all that kind of stuff,
Yeah.
So will I just share a couple of things maybe and
while you're sharing it there's just a question in from Padraig O'Morricu there. He's 79 DMD silage, so, and you're saying to restrict it, can you expand further? He's going to start drying up today. So I suppose, like, when we say restricting, I would think that we're talking about that they just run out, rather than having heaps of it in front of them all the time and constantly keeping it pushed into them to make sure that they eat loads of it. Like, you feed them today and let them run through till tomorrow kind of scenario.
Yeah, you want to be sort of trying to work out. I'll come to that there to cover Park's question in a second. It's just that's your chart there, Stuart. Is that on your screen there? You can see that. That's your
full screen there. So
yeah, sorry. Yeah. So that's kind of that's what we would be saying is kind of, it was a good question. Where do we want, if we could manage to keep the cows at condition score 3 every day of the year, we'd be happy, pretty much. So really what we're saying, that if they calve at 3 1/4 and they're kind of down at 275 at their lowest in the spring, and they're rising back towards 275 to 3 at breeding, we're happy enough. That's the range we want to keep them in. Up at 4, ready for the factory and a time bomb as far as milk fever is concerned. Down at 2.5, you're probably talking, that's a very shelly, kind of ribby type of a cow. The chances are in the spring you're going to lose milk production on those, and also they're likely be the ones that will need a seeder in April to get them going, right? So that's why it's so important that we talk about this condition. And it's often said, it is important when we say that nutrition has an effect on fertility. Of course it has, but it mightn't be the nut that you're feeding on the day that the straw goes into the cow that affects the fertility. It might actually be how you decide to manage the body condition score this week and next week, rather than what you do for the week before breeding. Because generally speaking, think about it, it's what happens 3 or 4 months before breeding that really affects the chances of a good breeding season. So that's an important point. Look at well, we talk about feeding targets for dry cows, right? So just if we take sort of standard kind of thin at drying off, we're talking about 9 units of energy or thereabouts. If they're sort of 275 at drying off, you're talking about 8 units of energy or thereabouts, which is kind of 11 kilos of sort of 70 DMD silage or something in that picture, right? The problem with your 78 DMD silage probably for dry cows is that basically they're going to eat more than the 11 kilos. They could eat up to 13 kilos of it, and obviously the energy content of it is higher. So the total intake could be up to 10 kilos of dry matter, or sorry, of energy, 10 units of 10 units of energy intake, which could lead you to sort of gaining maybe up to half a score of condition, which is too much. So look at here, Stuart, if you say 72 DMD silage even over 8 weeks, you're probably talking about gaining somewhere around 0.4 of a score. If you give them another 6 weeks on top of that, so a longer dry period, you could be talking about 0.4 and 0.5 up to nearly a full condition score gain over sort of an extended dry period. So that would be sort of going from 2.5 to 3.5. So you'd turn a thin cow into a slightly over-conditioned cow with 14 weeks on 72 DMD silage. So at 77, 78, you'd probably be looking at trying to limit that to sort of 10 kilos of dry matter intake. Basically, that would be the issue. Or certainly if there was second cut or maybe poorer quality stuff to be fed in the middle of winter, I think in the middle of the dry period, you probably would be you would probably try to do that. So diluting it down really would be the thing to be looking at. All right. Okay. So and maybe that's the issue too, Stuart, that there's such a range in silage quality, and we do need to make the decision based on silage quality. If you look here, our 68, 70 DMD silage, 68 would be kind of where the average would be. You're probably talking about gaining 1/4 of a score over 8 weeks. So you're talking about your cows that John Paul showed there, maybe at 275 to 3, that are already kind of warmed up, if you like, and are in decent shape. 8 to 10 weeks on a sort of standard silage for them will bring them in at the right condition. However, if your silage is kind of 65 and under, the chances are that over an 8-week dry period, the cow will actually lose condition. And even after giving her an extra 6 weeks dry to allow for a bit more settling in terms of intake and that, if you take the two of these together, the chances are that at 62, 64 DMD, even after a relatively extended dry period, the chances are that the cow will calve in probably not much different than she went dry. So if she's already at 3 1/4 and she's on that sort of stuff, she might be all right. If she's already thin and you're putting her on very poor silage, she's going to calve down. She's going to calve down thin. So in that case, you're really talking about sort of thin cows and poor silage. You're talking about supplementation. Average type of silage and decent condition, you're probably talking about being able to ad-lib feed that. Higher quality silage on cows that are already maybe in good shape, you probably need to be thinking about feed restriction in some way on those ones. All right.
Okay, so Padraig O'Mark, who's back in again there. When you're saying dilute, does that mean add in straw?
If the silage is up at 78 for dry cows, pork, it's almost to the point where you're saying at that level, you'd probably be saying it might have to be done. Yeah, it might have to be done. You're probably talking about bringing sort of a couple to 3 kilos of straw included. I would think it's probably depending if you're set up for that, I think it might be the thing to do. Now I know straw is kind of, it's hard to get your hands on it. It's hard to get your hands on it this year, but I think at the lower 70s, you probably get away with just feed restricting it. But like the silage you're talking about there is really good quality silage for milking cows, right? And would you feed a milking cow diet to a dry cow? You shouldn't really, because the over conditioning and the problems with milk fever that could hit you next spring. I think you're going to have to feed restrict, and maybe some dilution of straw might be necessary in that situation, right? So that's what we probably would have to say. So probably you're talking something like 2 to 3 kilos of straw, and just making sure that if you come into the late dry period, so coming into the time just pre-calving, just ensure that make sure there's adequate protein in the diet overall. So 12% protein in the diet overall. So possibly you might need to feed a protein source, something like a very small amount of soy or something, just for the couple of weeks before calving, to ensure that colostrum quality is good. But there's no need to go crazy on protein, as we look at it in a second. Just one thing, Stuart, when Pádraig brought that up, I just wanted to maybe just show, when we talk about this need for straw or not need for straw, I think in the circumstance where you're talking about there, and you're talking about trying to really dilute out the energy content of a silage that probably isn't suitable for dry cows. To be honest, it's a very, very good silage by the sounds of it for milkers, but maybe not for dry cows. There might be need for some dilution. But I just wanted to clarify one point about this, the need or otherwise for straw. Maybe if you're in a feed restricted situation, which is slightly different, where you're trying to make up the diet rather than try and dilute it out. Here's just some stuff done in 2018 with Mike Egan in Moorepark, where we looked at options where maybe silage was tight. It's just to illustrate the point now on the straw. So they had silage at 100% in the diet. They had silage and meal, which was basically if you were short of silage and you had meal to make up the difference. And then they had silage and meal, but straw included to bulk up the diet, right? So this is to bulk up the diet and saying, well, if I needed to feed silage and meal, do I need to fill the cow essentially with bulk in order to keep her right? So if you're talking about feeding meal as well. So look in that situation, you're basically saying that the intakes of UFL here is your energy. So your energy intakes were similar across the lot. And then you're talking about your silage, your straw, and then your silage and meal only. So basically, when they did those out, body condition at the end of the dry period was the same. Body condition score gain was relatively similar. Calf birth weight was relatively similar. Milk yield after calving was similar. Calving difficulty was similar. There wasn't a whole pile of difference in whether you bulked up the diet with straw or not. So it depends on it kind of depends on the situation you're in. So really what are we actually saying there? We're saying that if you're in a feed restricted situation, maybe if you're short of silage and you're going with silage and meals, putting in the straw didn't add that much of an advantage, really. Maybe in Pádraig's situation, if he has straw available, he already has very, very good silage and he's trying to dilute that down a little bit. A couple of kilos is probably no harm at all, but it's not essential to feed the extra bulk if you're in a sort of silage plus meal type of situation. Is that fair enough, Stuart?
Yeah, I suppose the reason for looking at that was because of the high level of meal that was going in because of the lack of silage
exactly.
So you had to add in a bit of extra fill. And one thing as well, Joe, actually going back to the previous slide, you don't need to go back to it now, but there's a double whammy when you're on poor quality silage as well, which is just to emphasize why people need to test silage, is that the intake, which is what you're just coming to actually here, sorry. The double whammy there is just going to hammer cows that are in poor condition on poor quality silage.
Yeah, so just remember that when we talk about poor quality silage, it's a combination of the energy content per kilo of silage and also the intake, that the amount of it that you will eat, right? So oftentimes you see, we look at it, we assume that the cow will eat 11 kilos of dry matter, right? And it just depends then on the energy content of the silage. The real trick is on the intake, as you say, Stuart. So it's just to draw lads' attention to that figure on their silage analysis. You'll see this intake value figure, and it's written kind of weird in places. Maybe it's written as grams per kilo body weight raised to the power of 0.7. Don't worry too much about that. That's just saying that it's basically measured per kilo of body weight essentially. So all we're saying here very simply is that sort of that wee table there will tell you. So the higher the intake value, the more the cow will eat of it per kilo of her own body weight essentially, right? So it's linked to body weight and it's linked to silage quality. So obviously higher quality silage, the sort of 78 DMD that Pádraig spoke about, if that's well preserved, good pH, good dry matter, well preserved and high quality, you're going to have a very high intake value. Obviously, if it's wet, acidic, low DMD, poor protein, the cow's just not going to want to eat as much of it essentially. So what's the range then? So if you take sort of a 625 kilo cow for handiness, we'll take the one in the middle at a low intake value of 70, she might eat 8.5 kilos of it. But if you give her 100, give her stuff that's up at 110, she might eat up to 13.5 kilos of silage. So really, we've always ended up in the 11 to 12 mark because it's basically the type of silage we've been making. So really 90 of an intake value, you're probably talking about 11.5. 100, you're probably talking 12.5 and up to 13. Enough to cause the cows to gain too much weight. But as you say down here, probably not going to be meeting requirements. So if you're down at that level, Stuart, and you're down at maybe needing to gain a little bit of weight, and the intake value is poor and the cows need to gain a quarter of the condition and the silage is poor quality, you probably are talking about 2 kilos. 2 kilos of something like barley and gluten, maybe 50-50, something like that. 2 kilos of hulls, maybe barley gluten, something as simple as that might just make the difference on the thinner ones, right? So, unfortunately, nobody wants to have to go in and feed meal to dry cows, but in a situation if silage quality is poor and the cows are sort of, as they say, a bit shelly themselves, that couple of kilos can make quite a difference for next year, I would say. All right.
Yeah, I suppose it just emphasises the importance of putting a focus on the silage, making sure that you have the right type of silage available to you.
Exactly, yeah. And I suppose this can get very complicated, and people say, well, it's dry cow silage and that's it. We don't need a lot of good stuff. But if we just go back very simply and say that if we take our dry cows, right, if we take that figure roughly, right, Stuart, of about 11 kilos of dry matter intake per cow per day while she's dry, right, and you say your cows are going to be dry for what, on average? Well, we say 70 days on average for most people, there or thereabouts, right? So you're saying that basically you need 11 kilos for 70 days. You need about 800 kilos dry matter of sort of 69, 70 DMD silage for your dry cows, right? That's what you need for the dry period. 8.8 of a ton, which is equivalent to about 4 bales worth, thereabouts. That's what you need for your dry cows, and then all the rest of the silage in the yard should be good quality. That's for your heifers, for your weaning heifers, for your stale cows in the autumn, and for your fresh cows in the spring. So when you add that up, like, you tell me how much silage does your standard farmer around Mitchelstown from I need in the yard? Did they need 1.3, 1.4 ton per cow, 1.5?
Yeah, sure. We work off the 1.5. Probably work off of close to 5 months requirements in a lot of cases.
Right. Yeah, and if stocking is higher, that's going to be higher. So basically, what we're saying that at 1.5, we're saying that half your silage needs to be for dry cows, and the other half goes to milkers and young stock. So half your silage, at least half your silage, needs to be good quality. Maybe even a little bit more. It's probably easier to restrict good silage than it is to make up for bad stuff. So we need to move away from the notion that what we're talking about here is, making a few bales for a few surplus bales as quality, and the rest can be, basically a pile of glorified straw. That can't be the way. Can't be the way, particularly as we're extending into longer lactations, right? So, look, I thought that was an interesting study actually. That it just puts the question of whether, if you're in a feed restricted situation, do you need to dilute with straw? The suggestion there is clear enough that, and if you look here, that they've basically had the same energy and protein, no matter which way you made it up, right? As long as the energy and protein requirements of the cow were met, and the mineral requirements of the cow were met, it didn't really make that much difference how you arrived at it, whether that was silage or a combination of silage and straw and meal, or just silage and meal. As long as the energy and intake values were correct and hit the targets, you were happy enough that the cows came out the same at the other end. If you get me, all right.
Yeah,
So
I'm sure the same is true of in-calf heifers can be, and weanling heifers can be run on a straw and meal only diet in some cases too. Quite like the energy density of the diet is the same. It's just how you make it up is the thing.
That's exactly it. And just one other final point, maybe we might keep it moving. That one other final point is we look here. Calf birth weight was sort of pretty much within a kilo or so of across the treatments, right? And I know that certainly when we bring up the sort of the idea that some of the thinner cows might need a bit of sort of barley gluten to get them into shape for calving down, a lot of farms over the years would have said, well, I don't want to do that because I don't want to grow the calf. I don't want to have the calf will be too big. Like you've often heard that one, I suppose. So look, just to be clear on that one, that the condition, the cow will sort of manage her own intake in order to make sure that the calf gets what they need first and foremost. So the calf's priority, and then the extra meal is really a question of whether the body condition is improved or not. So it's not actually that relevant to what happens to the size of the calf. It's really the meal will be really it'll change the body condition of the cow, not really the size of the calf. Just to really emphasize that Mark McGee in Grange did work on this a couple of years ago in continental suckler cows, and they fed the cows that they would either lose 40 kilos, hold their weight, or gain 50 kilos of weight over the dry period, right? Which is a huge range in terms of the density of the dry cow diet. And there was about a kilo difference on average birth weight across the groups. It had zero effect on the size of the calf, whether the cow was pretty much half starved, if you could say. Well, that's not true either, but to lose weight, to sort of hold the weight, or to gain a lot of weight, it had zero effect on the size of the calf. It's the sire used. It's the sire and the dam's genetics that dictate the calf size, not a couple of kilos of meal to a thin cow. All right.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I suppose the other thing is if people are worried about that, like it's coming back to what John Paul and John were looking at below in the yard, it's condition scoring and start drying off cows early rather than having to feed meal if people don't believe you, Joe. So it's like,
Yeah, I would think so. Look, I think management, I'd rather do, as John Paul was saying there, like what's easier, Stuart, here? Like what John Paul...
For sure. And sure, as well, Joe, like the vast majority of yards that we'll go into, we do, like John Paul is blessed with the space and the facilities he has. Like he can just break up groups of cows and stuff, but that isn't commonplace on most farms. Like so.
Yeah, I'm just counting it up. Like if you count in the yard at Moorepark, there's 6 and 4... There's 10, at least 10 divisions if you want in the yard. Most yards you go into, there's 2 at most, if not 2. So look at, in fairness, like over the years, you'll always seen that if there's with everybody coming in and out and the different trials going on, I think it's one thing that John Paul would always insist on is that when you get your cows back after the trials, that their body condition is right and that the calf down in the right condition. Otherwise, that makes the spring easier. That's for sure. So a couple of extra, go out this evening, have a look. If they're a bit thin, think about trying them off that bit earlier. And it's much easier than having to split them out and feed them kilos of meal over the winter period to try and make them catch up. It's far handier, and you're not losing whatever bit of extra milk you get in the next 2 weeks. You'll gain that back easily by the extra production next spring. So that's the one. Just another one I just wanted to maybe touch on, Stuart, about maybe this is maybe moving further into the maybe it's more of a question for next January, maybe if in early February, the question about pre-calving protein, right? And there's a fair bit of work done on this in Moorepark and in the States and elsewhere around how much protein do you actually need. And the sort of the simple message here is that across a heap of different trials done, there's it's basically plus or minus a half a kilo of milk or thereabouts, depending on how you change the protein percent, right? So look at the main thing is that if the consistent message is kind of hit the 12.5% target for your dry cows. If you hit that target in terms of your total diet, that's the best middle ground you're going to get, and there's very little evidence of any advantage going higher than that. So if your silage protein is sort of 13%, I think you're on your 70 DMD at 13%. That's what you're getting to your dry cows in late dry period. You're fine, I think, in terms of protein content. If you're in a situation where silage quality is a bit raw, a bit poor, if you were short of silage and you were adding in straw or hay to try and stretch out feed, for example, and you were bringing the total protein in the diet of the forage part down maybe closer to 10%, there would be an advantage in including a supplementary protein source for the last couple of weeks. And I suppose the way to look at that, Stuart, is measure your colostrum quality in next spring. And if your colostrum quality is good, it's a real measure of whether your protein nutrition in your cows is decent enough pre-calving, right? So people that are feeding poor quality silage, or maybe feeding a lot of hay or straw or something, you'll often see that there's a lot of cows failing the colostrum test on the refractometer. So it's a nice measure, really, a practical outcome of it. So 12.5%. Watch your heifers and your herds on poor silage. So obviously we're not here to talk about replacement heifers, but I do think that don't be shy of a little bit of additional protein on those over the sort of December, January period. It'll pay you back to make sure they meet their protein requirements. The other one that comes up, and it's an interesting one maybe before we move on to something else, is this question of feeding meal pre-calving, right? And this is different now to what we're talking about. We are recommending for sure that if the cows are way behind body condition, it's too late to give them the extended dry period. Feeding the cow correctly over the dry period to catch her up in terms of her body condition is recommended, right? That's the first point. It's a slightly different thing then when we come to talk about, is there a value in sort of starting to introduce meals pre-calving to sort of get the cow ready for her diet post-calving? Do you know what I'm getting at, Stuart? Yeah. That's a different question.
A freshening diet, like as such.
A freshening diet and steaming up and this kind of stuff, right? And I don't know. Look, this has been talked about since the mid-90s, and it's something that I think a lot of people might have tried it over the years, and some people said, you know what, this is too much fucking more hassle than it's worth nearly, because you have to start introducing meals pre-calving. But look, this is just some work done from a couple of years ago in a system where, you know, and I picked this one because it's representative of it's very simple. An awful lot of studies have the same outcome on this, right? But this is a system where you'd be talking about getting up to a 50-60% concentrate diet post-calving, right? So look at feeding 17% starch, so that's feeding a high starch concentrate, or feeding a high starch diet, which is a concentrate diet pre-calving, versus a lower starch one, and then see what happens post-calving. So essentially, no difference post-calving really at all. So what you do is you end up increasing the intake pre-calving, but really not that difference there's no major benefit post-calving at all in terms of intake. Does it mean the cow will go on to her post-calving intake better because she got fed meal for a couple of weeks pre-calving? The answer to that is likely no big difference at all. There is a risk of additional risk of ketosis, because if that extra meal causes over-conditioning. Now again, to emphasize, we're talking about here where cows are already in good nick, and we're talking about going in with extra meal to try and transition them on to the thing. It's not the same as feeding the thin cow, right? There is a bit of an extra risk of ketosis by doing it. So look, I would be saying that really, you know, sometimes you see a benefit for a week or two post-calving, but you've bought that feed as meal pre-calving, or bought that milk as feed pre-calving. So we wouldn't be really recommending it at all, I think. And even talking to some of the lads in Hillsborough over the last couple of years, did say they've moved away from that notion, and they're going more towards making sure that they've got high quality forage for the diet post-calving, making sure your minerals are good pre-calving, and getting a slow and steady increase in intake after calving is much more important than trying to have the cow sort of ready to go on a high meal diet straight away, which doesn't really work. All right, which is a good news story for farms, because it means they don't have to bother with it.
So the point you're making, Joe, is all like your freshly calved cow start around the 3 kilos, and depending on your grass availability, maybe lift her up by a kilo a day or a kilo every 2 days.
Yeah, and look at
up to your 5 or 6,
depending on
access to grass you have, etc. Like,
and just to, sorry not to be flicking through slides, but just look at this for a second. That's your sort of, this is your cow, this is calving day here on 0, right? And this is your calcium levels, right? So cows without milk fever kind of come along handy enough, and then they get this sort of a dip, right? They get a slight dip and then they're back to normal. The cows that get milk fever take a severe dip and then it takes them a couple of days to get over it, right? And what does that mean? At that point, if the blood calcium is very low, you're talking about a risk of downer cows, you're talking about a risk of displacements, you're talking about, risks of increased risk of lameness a few weeks down the line. There's a lot of risks with having low blood calcium status. So what are we really saying there? You're back to normal after about 3 days anyway, right, or close to normal. So look after the cow for a few days after she calves, and then get her onto the grazing regime. I would. That's where a lot of us have gone now. I think
transition the cow post calving rather than
transition the cow post. Exactly. Like there's no point in going in sort of steaming her up and then sending her out the first morning with the calf sort of still hanging out of her. Like it's not where we want to be. We sort of just give the cow a chance to get her calcium status back into track. And I think a lot of people have moved in that direction anyway, with a colostrum mob maybe that's managed with a wee bit of extra TLC, that the cow really gets looked after, extra attention until she's back in the tank essentially, and then after that off you go, and you're away with it then. So it's the transition, as you say, the transition after calving into the main herd is probably more important than sort of this pre-calving concentrate notion. Absolutely. Okay,
very good.
Okay. Do you want to say something about minerals, or are we?
Yeah, you can touch on it quickly. I suppose the time frame for it as well, Joe. We'll wrap it up then at that.
Yeah,
so how long should people be feeding the minerals for, etc.
Okay, so look, the first thing I'm just going to make a point here is this is our. We might have talked about this before, but I just want to make the point that the potassium levels. Just check the potassium in your silage. If it's at 2.3% or thereabouts, you're probably okay with your standard mineral. If it's up at 3%, which is kind of what your kind of high quality silage might be, or your grazed grass might be, just talk to your advisor about it. But like sometimes you have to check the mineral content in your silage as well as your as well as the mineral content in the bag, Stuart. So if you have had problems in the past, check the potassium content in your silage. That's all we're saying, as well as the DMD, right? That's one point. On the minerals then, we're talking about feeding minerals for sort of 6 weeks anyway pre-calving, and the reason we're feeding them for that long is to try and get the trace mineral values up in the cows, particularly on some of the trace minerals anyway. Sort of 6 weeks pre-calving, and then obviously you're onto your post-calving ration that's mineralized too. A couple of quick points, not to delay us too long. Magnesium, 22 to 25% on the label, 2 to 4% maybe on phosphorus, and then you're going to have obviously your trace minerals as well: selenium, iodine, copper, cobalt, etc. A lot of the minerals will come in very similar on those in terms of the rates. The difference would be on a lot of minerals is whether they're a protected mineral source or they're a straight kind of it's an inert source or a standard source. So the difference in cost is probably whether there's a blend of the different types of minerals or not. I would say that's a farm by farm decision. If you think you've had problems in the past or deficiency problems in the past, there probably is benefit in going the extra mile in terms of the protected mineral sources. If you haven't had major problems in the past, meeting the requirements on a good standard mineral will do you, right? One of the things that has come up on a few farms over the last couple of years, vitamin D. Just make sure that your vitamin D levels are high. What this is showing you is what's in the bag versus what the cow eats. So essentially per kilo, if the cow's eating 120 grams, she's eating about this much. So look at 12 to 14,000 units of vitamin D is where a lot of the compounders are probably getting to at this stage. That's good for milk fever control, as well as your mag. And just to wrap it up, Stuart, just quickly, just looking at three different minerals for a second and comparing the three across the line, because this is what people ultimately are going to have to do. So we have our premium, our super, and our elite. So I just make up whatever name you want. Magnesium at 15% versus 20%. So straight away, I'm probably saying, yeah, I'm going over here because that's too low as far as I'm concerned. I'd rather see that a little bit higher even in some cases. No phosphorus added. There's 3% phosphorus here. So certainly I'm obviously fishing in this pool straight away. You've got protected. You can see there's no protected selenium, or so you're talking about a range of different sources. And finally, your vitamin D levels are up at 120,000 in the bag versus 50,000. So you're basically saying, you know, is it worth the extra few quid or whatever to go to this level versus this level? I would say that it is. I would be happy that if you fed that for sort of your 6 weeks pre-calving or thereabouts, and transition the cows correctly, you're probably in a better place than going with this one. That's it. Okay.
Okay, so there's just one question there, Jordan, and one or two points that I'll make to myself then as well. Can a lack of pee increase the risk of milk fever?
A lack of pee can increase the risk of milk fever. It can. So 0.3% in the diet would be sort of what's recommended. So 0.3%. So you'd look at your silage mineral analysis if you think you've had a problem, and if it's low in phosphorus, kind of sort of 3, depending on where it is, 3 to 5% added phosphorus in the mineral should help to solve your problem, right? But I will make just one point on that, is that if your bag mineral is kind of set for sort of 120 gram feeding rate, I would be suggesting that we should sort of stick to the recommended feeding rate, because I've seen it in a couple of cases where people were maybe having problems with milk fever and they were firing in maybe 150, 160 grams to try and fix the problem. The problem is with phosphorus, you can overdo it in terms of phosphorus for milk fever. You can increase the risk of milk fever by feeding too much phosphorus. So 3 to 5% phosphorus in a 120 gram feeding rate is probably where you're going to be. So long story short, yes, you should have it in there to improve your risk on milk fever, but don't overdo it.
And the other point, of course, is if it isn't in, it's automatically making a mineral cheaper because phosphorus is expensive.
Phosphorus is expensive. Yeah, it's expensive to add in, but yeah, look at again. I would say, Stuart, you know, if we're saying 120 gram feeding rate for 45 days, 50 days, it's only 5 kilos a cow, so a ton will do 200 cows nearly. So the extra cost for a couple, you know, the extra cost is relatively small, within reason now, of course, but the extra cost for having the right spec is relatively small.
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose I would always be of the opinion it's kind of a case of buyer beware. Like if something is cheap, you just need to look to see why is it cheap relative to other stuff that's on the market, maybe, and kind of dig a little bit deeper.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And as you said, like what's the history of the farm as well? Like, so if you've had problems before, it's probably, I would be very much against taking the cheap option in terms of minerals without knowledge behind the decision, really. Like, so a lot of what we've spoken about is coming back to feed analysis, so both in the form of just knowing your standard dry matter and DMD and protein levels in your silage, but also the mineral content as well. So people should maybe be looking into that. The other question, I suppose, then, and just in relation to the in-calf heifers in terms of minerals, would you think that they should be getting it for a little bit longer, given that they've had no access to minerals, we'll say, really, or you know, the way that grass mineral profile is poor or isn't 100% optimum, I suppose, is the better way to put it, rather than to say it's poor.
Yeah, I know what you're saying, but then their requirements too, relative to the milking cow, would be slightly lower as well. You know what I mean?
Okay.
They're not generally, they won't be under as much. There wouldn't be the same offtake of mineral with them. Look, I would say this, to keep it simple, short, I would say just make sure that they're all starting for sort of at least 6 weeks. I don't think there's a huge need for additional. One final point on that too is that when you look at that, you know, the trace minerals are one thing. The major minerals like mag and phos are important as well. You know, for those ones, you know, you can't. They have to be fed. They have to be fed in large quantities. So basically, what you're saying is, you can't bolus for your major minerals, obviously. So that's just one thing.
Okay.
Just make sure that the bolus will only cover the trace minerals. The other, as we said, it's 5 kilos. The cow's going to need 5 kilos of over the dry period. You need 5 kilos of total mineral intake. That's a big bolus. Like, that's not, you know. The bolus can't do that. So that's what I mean. So look, just be careful on that one. So look, just to maybe for me to shut up now, first things, back to John Paul, one of the big ones, get your body condition looked at this week, sort out the ones that are underweight, and think about if the silage quality is very, very high, you may have to feed restrict during December and January. If you have the feed space doing it. It might be just as simple as limiting the total silage intake per day. May or may not be beneficial in that such circumstances. A couple of kilos of straw mightn't hurt either, like just to slow them down a little bit, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is, if you've had niggly problems in the past, do a silage mineral analysis. Look at your phosphorus levels, and particularly your K levels, your potassium levels. If they're too high, you might need to think about maybe diluting that out, or maybe feeding maybe their second cut silage or something might be lower in K. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing then is, take a look at your mineral. If it's very cheap, figure out why it's very cheap. Is it low in magnesium? Is it low in phosphorus? Is it low in the vitamins, which tend to be expensive as well? If it is, maybe you should be thinking about moving to a better spec overall. So I think for most people, if they get on top of those few points, it can make a difference.
Yeah, and I think just, I suppose, the final, you've done my summary there for me now, Joe, in fairness. So just the last point is something we were discussing yesterday evening, like that just with the mineral, be careful that the couple of quid that you're saving won't cost you an awful lot more in the springtime, at a time that you really won't have time to be messing with problems, basically. Like, so just to check that back. So that's I'm loath to ask you this, because I know you've an answer for it anyway. Have you any views on choline and dry cows?
Protected choline and dry cows.
Yeah,
look,
I think you're going looking at it.
We have actually. There's myself and Mike were talking about this for over the last couple of months about. It's something that, I suppose, it's something that we're interested in doing from in terms of studies in Moorepark, that, you know, the idea we're sort of getting around to looking at now is for some of these different ideas or options that can we do things like that to prime the cows to be better, to be really ready for action when they go when they calve and go for grass. So the choline, I suppose, what the idea there would be, the feed for choline, it does, and there is good evidence of it from the international work, that it does help with fat metabolism post calving. So it helps the cow to cope with negative energy balance to a better degree, Stuart. So feeding for a few weeks pre-calving, certainly, to prime the system. There is some work beginning on that in Moorepark in the next couple of weeks. So while I'd say certainly there's good evidence that it can have a positive effect in other systems, we're having a look at it now to see what will it add in a pasture system. So the message really is watch this space on that one, I think.
Yeah, very good. I'll have to call it at that. So just to remind people that we've had a lot of webinars this week, obviously, with the dairy conference and so forth, but if you have missed any of them, they'll be available. Some of them are already available for people to look back at. Patrick Owen and myself are doing Thinking of Dairy and Getting the Basics Right series at the moment, and that's back on again next Monday, when Patrick will be looking at grazing infrastructure and I'll be looking at reseeding, and we'll be talking to Paul and Robert Tobin in relation to their experience around grazing infrastructure and their reseeding plans. And then next week, Labour Management Series is back on again. We'll be talking to Nullig and Marion again next week about managing your time to maximum effect. And just a final reminder then about Emma Louise's podcasts, which are ongoing. This week's one is in relation to the surveillance and early detection of disease with Vet Michael Horn. So just to remind you that they're available through any of the podcast streaming services, and to look them up. They're always very interesting and very good. Joe, as always, pleasure talking to you. Great information. Thanks very much. And thanks to John McCabe, and thanks to John Paul as well for facilitating us with the cows and so forth. So that's it for today, folks. We'll talk to you again next week. In the meantime, have a nice weekend and take care and mind yourselves.